For each fight on this weekend's upcoming card, including for the prelims, I'm going to be comparing stats, reviewing recent fighter history, analyzing the results of my 7 data science prediction models, and giving a combined weighted prediction based on those models. I'll also provide my final prediction combining both quantitative and qualitative information together. Later this week, I'll upload a video covering promising underdogs, best and expensive favorites, and prop bets for y'all to consider, which I'll highlight some great opportunities for you guys. Hopefully you can use these predictions and data to confirm your picks, avoid mistakes, find value bets, or just informative and entertainment purposes to prepare for the lead up to this weekend's event. Please like and subscribe if you find this content interesting, informative, or helpful. It helps keep me motivated to create these videos for you all. I've also added my Patreon information in the description if you'd like to support the channel through that. There's a $10 a month contribution tier and a $20 a month premium tier, which will give you early access to all of the analysis and results for my videos, as well as additional data analysis and stats. So that includes my prediction model results, fighter history, stat overviews, promising underdogs, best and expensive favorites, prop bets to consider, and a deep dive into each fighter's record history and an analysis through each of their individual historical fights. So you'll get all sorts of stats and data analysis which will help you with your picks and bets. And for $20 a month, which is around $5 per event, you can get all of that information. You can purchase event analysis separately, but the membership is cheaper and easier. Plus, you're directly helping improve and expand the content of this channel. Running this data and analysis, each of the prediction models, the fight simulations, and updating the site takes hours every day and week, so I'd greatly appreciate your support. And thank you all for the recent support that you have shown. It truly means the world to me that we can share our passion for MMA and continue to build this community together. The last thing that I want to mention is that there is a BetUS promotion in the description below. If you use that link, it's an affiliate link, so if you set up your account, you'll get a promotional offer with that. I'm excited to continue working on this analysis and content for you all. Thank you guys again for all of your support. Let's go ahead and dive right into the predictions. All right, so for the first fight of UFC 305, let's get hyped, guys. It's a great week. We have Dana White Contender Series. We have UFC 305. First fight, we have Casey O'Neill versus Luana Santos. Let's go and review their stats here. Casey O'Neill is 5 feet 6 inches tall with a reach of 69 inches, and she's 26 years old. Now, on the other hand, we have Luana Santos, who is also 5 feet 6 inches tall, but she has a 2-inch reach disadvantage here. She has a 67-inch reach, and she's 2 years younger at 24 years old. Now, when it comes to striking, Casey O'Neill lands 8.41 strikes per minute, which is a pretty good amount of volume there, but with a 54% accuracy, not bad. Luana Santos, on the other hand, only lands 5.33 strikes per minute, about 3 less per minute, but at the same accuracy of 55%, so she lands less volume and she throws less volume. Now, as far as grappling goes, O'Neill lands 1.77 takedowns on average with a 38% accuracy, while Santos, on the other hand, lands 2.03 takedowns on average, but with a way better accuracy of 60%. And lastly, when it comes to defense, Casey O'Neill absorbs 6.3 strikes per minute with a 56% striking defense and a 66% takedown defense, whereas Luana Santos absorbs 3.21 strikes per minute with a 65% striking defense and a 66% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Casey O'Neill's recent fight history. Now recently, Casey's coming off of a loss against Ariane Da Silva, which was via submission back in December of 2023. Her total record is 9 wins and 2 losses, and out of those 9 wins, 3 of those were KO/TKOs, 2 of those were submissions, and 4 were decision victories, which gives her a 56% finishing rate. Now her 2 losses are split between 1 submission loss and 1 decision loss. She does have 1 first round finish. Recently, she's won 3 out of her last 5 fights, but she is coming off of back-to-back losses in this particular fight. In fact, her most recent win was back in February of 2022, and her most recent loss was in December of 2023. Now let's flip over to Luana Santos' recent fight history. Now recently, Luana Santos is coming off of a win against Maria Agapova, which was via submission back in July of 2024. That's right, she just fought a month ago, and she's coming back into UFC 305 and fighting in this card. Her total record, 8 wins and 1 loss. Out of those 8 wins, 1 of those was a KO/TKO, 4 of them were submissions, pretty impressive, and 3 were decision victories, which gives her a 62.5% finishing rate. Now, out of her 1 loss, that was a decision loss. She does have 4 first-round finishes, which is really impressive. She's recently won all 5 of her last 5 fights, and she is on a 5-fight win streak, so she hasn't lost in a minute. In fact, the last time she lost was back in July of 2022, and her most recent win, of course, is July of 2024, just last month. Now let's take a look at what my prediction models predicted, their weighted average, and my final pick that takes that and adds other non-stat based research and fight film study observations and takes all of that qualitative plus quantitative information into account together. So 2 of 7 of my prediction models are leaning towards Casey O'Neill, and 5 are leaning towards Luana Santos. And when I weigh those prediction models together, I'm getting a very narrow 50.3% probability of victory for Luana Santos. Now for my final prediction, I'm giving her a slightly more confident 56% probability of victory, and there's several reasons for that, but let's first talk about what I see on paper. Luana Santos is 2 years younger. She has a 1% higher striking accuracy, which I know isn't a lot, but it's still a little bit better. Now, she absorbs 3.09 less strikes per minute, which is huge. She has a 9% higher striking defense, which is also huge. She lands 0.26 more takedowns on average and has a 22% higher takedown accuracy. And lastly, she lands 1.3 more submissions on average per fight. Now, she's won 8 fights. She's finished 63% of them. Out of her 3 UFC fights, she's won all 3 of those, which is impressive. And of course, recently she's won all 5 of her last 5 fights. In fact, she's coming off of a 5-5 win streak. Last time she lost was 2 years ago, back in July of 2022. But let's talk about reasons aside from stats alone as to why I'm leaning towards Luana Santos in this fight instead of Casey O'Neill. It would honestly boil down to her exceptional submission skills. She has plenty of wins by submission, and she's pretty skilled when it comes to those submissions and grappling. She has a pretty good striking rate as well, which does make her a challenging opponent in this matchup. Santos also has a really good defensive game. If you've seen some of her fights, you can see that she is savvy with the defense when it comes to crucial times in fights. She has a good strike defense rate as well. I think it was 65%. Recently, she's on a really good winning streak. She has a lot of confidence and momentum on her side, and I think that that's going to give her a little bit of a psychological edge coming into this fight. Now, it's important to note she's coming in on short notice here. Santos is the betting favorite, even though she's coming in on that short notice. So that really shows who the market thinks is more skilled and more capable of getting it done, and I think they got this one right. I would say that the odds makers got this one right. I like her solid takedown defense, and I think that that can neutralize some of O'Neill's grappling attempts, and as long as Luana Santos is able to manage and outmaneuver all of that volume striking that we see from Casey O'Neill, she should be able to get it done coming into this fight. Now, Casey O'Neill has a lot of potential. I mean, she's growing really quickly, and she has a lot of support on her side, but I'm still leaning towards Luana Santos in this fight. I think that she has everything she needs to get it done, especially from a technical perspective. That's why I would take Luana Santos via decision. And we're going to talk about bets a little bit later this week, so stay tuned. Probably in about 2 days, I'll upload and work on that betting video. So if you haven't already, please like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more. For the next fight, we have Stewart Nicoll versus Jesus Aguilar, and please bear with me, we do not have a lot of statistical information on Stewart Nicoll, but that does not prevent me from doing some research and putting in the homework for you guys and sharing my observations. So let's get started. Stewart Nicoll is 5 feet 5 inches tall. We do not know his reach. I couldn't find it. He is 29 years old, but on the other hand, Jesus Aguilar is 5 feet 4 inches tall. He's 1 inch shorter. He has a reach of 62 inches, and he's 28 years old. Both of these guys are flyweights. They're your short fighters that are really, really light like a feather. Let's break down their striking stats, or at least Aguilar's, right? So Aguilar lands 1.49 strikes per minute with a 50% accuracy. And as far as grappling goes, Aguilar lands 1.9 takedowns with a 33% accuracy. And lastly, when it comes to defense, Aguilar absorbs 1.11 strikes per minute with a 59% striking defense and a 40% takedown defense. Now, what I was able to do was take a look at Stewart Nicoll's recent fight history. Now, he is making his UFC debut this weekend, but his total record is 8 wins and no losses. So he is undefeated coming into this fight. A lot of confidence and momentum on his side. Out of his 8 wins, 4 of them were KO/TKOs, 3 of them were submissions, and 1 was a decision victory, which gives him an 88% finishing rate. Now, he does have 5 first-round finishes, which is really impressive out of his 8 wins. And the most recent time that he won was actually March 8th of 2024, just this year, a few months ago. Now, flipping over to Jesus Aguilar's recent fight history. Recently, Aguilar is coming off of a win against Mateusz Mendonca via split decision, which was back in February of this year. His total record, 10 wins and 2 losses, also pretty impressive. Out of those 10 wins, 1 of them was a KO/TKO victory, 6 of them were submission victories, and 3 were decision victories, which does give him a 70% finishing rate. Now, his 2 losses were via submission, so he might have a little bit of a vulnerability when it comes to opponents that are really good at grappling and submissions. He does have 3 first-round finishes, though. Recently, he's done really well. He's won 4 out of his last 5 fights, and he is coming off of back-to-back victories into this fight. His most recent win was back in February of 2024. His most recent loss was back in February of 2023. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't run these fighters through my prediction models because of the debut here. However, the odd probabilities are leaning towards Stewart Nicoll with a 65.8% probability of victory. And I do generally agree with that because Stewart Nicoll does have a height advantage in this fight. He's won 8 fights. He's finished 88% of them. And he hasn't lost a single time. But there are also stylistic reasons that make me like Stewart Nicoll as a victor in this fight instead of Jesus Aguilar. And the reason would be because of his impressive finishing ability. He's secured a lot of his fights with a first round stoppage, which is impressive. Also, he will be fighting in front of his home crowd in Perth, Australia. And I think that that's going to give him a little bit of a sense of motivation. When you have the crowd backing you, you're making your debut, you have strong momentum on your side as you're walking in that octagon. And I think he's going to be very eager to set a strong impression as he starts his UFC career. He's also very versatile when it comes to striking and grappling, and that generally makes him, he has potential to be a very good, well-rounded fighter. Do I think that he's proven himself as a well-rounded fighter so far? I think he's headed there. And I think he has the makings of a fighter who can be well-rounded. We're going to have to kind of see, though, because when you step in the UFC, it's kind of a different playing field compared to those other promotions. We've seen a lot of guys, as soon as they step in the UFC, they're just not impressive. So hopefully, Stewart Nicoll is not that. I don't think he is. He has potential here. I would say that the regional dominance that he has had, he's beaten some of those best pound for pound fighters in Australia and New Zealand, and I think that that does speak to some of his high skill level. Also, Aguilar has been a little bit inconsistent. He hasn't done well against Tafa Taira or Gabriel Valdez, although Tafa Taira, I mean, we know that guy is an absolute beast. He's on a tear and rising very quickly within the UFC, especially in this division. So I kind of understand, but that doesn't really take away from Aguilar struggling against that kind of fighter. So Aguilar has some holes in his game. We've seen that time and time again. He's still a good fighter. He's young. He's 28 years old. He has potential. But I'm still leaning towards Stewart Nicoll in this particular fight. Now, I don't think that Nicoll's going to be able to get a finish in this fight. I think Aguilar can stand his ground, and this will go to the judges. I believe that Nicoll will win via unanimous decision, or worst case scenario, split decision, but I think the decision will ultimately go to Nicoll for this fight. In the next fight, we have Song Kenan versus Ricky Glenn. Let's go and review their stats here. Song is 6 feet tall with a reach of 71 inches, and he's 34 years old. Now, Ricky Glenn, very similar. He's 6 feet tall as well with a reach of 70 inches, so he has a 1 inch reach disadvantage here, and he's 35 years old. He's 1 year older than Song Kenan. So when it comes to striking, Song lands 4.36 strikes per minute with a 46% accuracy. Now, Ricky Glenn, on the other hand, lands 3.94 strikes per minute with a 43% accuracy. That's pretty similar, but Song has a little bit of the advantage when it comes to the stats on paper. So as far as grappling goes, Song lands 0.34 takedowns on average with a 50% accuracy, while Ricky Glenn, he lands slightly more takedowns on average at 0.55, but with a bit of a worse accuracy at 13%. And lastly, when it comes to defense, Song absorbs 6.38 strikes per minute with a 50% striking defense and a 61% takedown defense, whereas on the other hand, Ricky Glenn absorbs 4.1 strikes per minute with a 51% striking defense and a 68% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Song Kenan's recent fight history. Recently, Song is coming off of a loss against Kevin Jusset via unanimous decision, which was back in December of 2023. Now, Song's total record is 21 wins and 8 losses. That's kind of mediocre overall. His 21 wins, out of those, 9 of them were KO/TKO victories, 9 were submission victories, which is impressive, and only 3 went to the judges and he got decision victories, which does give him an impressive 86% finishing rate. Now let's break down his losses. Out of those 8 losses, 4 of them were via KO/TKO, and the other 4 were decision losses. Now, Song also has 13 first-round finishes. Out of his 21 wins, 13 of them are first-round finishes. Recently, though, he hasn't done too well. He's only won 2 out of his last 5 fights, and on top of that, he's coming off of a loss into this fight. Now, his most recent win was back in August of 2023. His most recent loss was back in December of 2023. Now, let's take a look at Ricky Glenn's recent fight history. Now, recently, Ricky Glenn's coming off of a loss against Drew Dober via KO/TKO back in October of 2023. Ricky Glenn's total record is 22 wins and 8 losses. Also not impressive, but kind of equivalent to Song Kenan. This is an interesting matchup. Now, out of those 22 wins, 13 of those were KO/TKOs, 3 of those were submissions, and 6 were decision victories, which makes him kind of balanced. He's able to take control of the fight, take it to the judges. He's also able to get the finish and get the KO/TKO, or sometimes even the submission. He has a 73% finishing rate, which is respectable. Now, out of his 8 losses, 2 of them were via KO/TKO, 2 of them were submission losses, and 4 were decision losses. Now, he does have 7 first-round finishes, which is impressive, but recently he has not done well. He's only won 1 out of his last 5 fights, and he's on coming off of back-to-back losses into this particular fight. In fact, the most recent time that he won was back in June of 2021. That is really terrible. The most recent time he lost was back in October of 2023. Now let's take a look at those prediction models. Let's look at their weighted average, and my final pick that takes that and adds other non-stat based research and fight film study observations and takes those into account as well. So 4 of 7 of my prediction models are leaning towards Kenan, and 3 are leaning towards Ricky Glenn. And when I weigh those prediction models together, I'm getting a 55.3% probability victory in Kenan's favor. Now for my final prediction, I'm giving him an even more confident 64% probability of victory, and I'll tell you why. Kenan is the younger fighter slightly. He has a reach advantage of an inch in this fight. He lands 0.42 more strikes per minute. He has a 3% higher striking accuracy, and most importantly, he has a 37% higher takedown accuracy. The guy's won 21 fights. He's finished 86% of them. He's won 5 fights out of his 9 UFC fights, so he's had 9 fights within the UFC, and he's won a little more than half of those. Not only is that good experience, but that shows that he's on the right stage for his fighting career. Now recently, of course, he hasn't done too well. He's only won 2 out of his last 5 fights, and he's coming off of a loss here. But that hasn't really been much of a streak for me to consider that, oh, this guy's momentum's completely broken down. Of course, because 2 fights ago, the guy's coming off a victory. But anyways, let's talk about reasons aside from stats alone or the record itself as to why I think Kenan will defeat Ricky Glenn. First, I think that he has a bit of a weight advantage here. He's more experienced within the welterweight division itself, unlike Ricky Glenn, who's kind of moving up into this weight class from lightweight. I will also say Song has very powerful striking, and that's going to be a significant asset in this fight. He has a very high rate of knockouts in his professional fighting career, and I think that his experience in that higher weight class does suggest that he can handle some of those larger opponents that are kind of better and stronger than Glenn. Now, despite some of his recent losses, Song does show resilience in his fights. He secured a win against Rolando Bedoya, which was impressive. Now, in contrast, Glenn, his recent losses by KO/TKO, it kind of further highlights some of the potential vulnerabilities that this guy has, especially in his defense. The last thing that I'll say that's going against Ricky Glenn here is the fact that his previous 2 fights ended with him getting KO/TKO'd in the first round. Ask yourself, how many fighters have you witnessed that were knocked out twice back to back? Forget the fact that it's in the first round, just knocked out in general and lost back to back, and they're able to bounce back and be the same fighter that they were before those knockouts. If you've been watching MMA for a while, you know the answer to that question is not very many fighters at all. Not very many fighters are the same fighter that they were before they got knocked out like that. Not only that, but let me tell you this, that was the first time that Ricky Glenn got KO/TKO'd, and he got KO/TKO'd back to back. Previous to those fights, or prior to those fights, I should say. What is happening to my grammar? Anyways, prior to those fights, he lost via decision in different times throughout his career. And before then, it was a submission loss, and then a split decision loss, and a submission loss all the way back in 2009. But point is, Ricky Glenn, he just now got KO/TKO twice. He's not the same fighter. Also, he's 35 years old. Keep that in mind. I think when you pair everything that I said together, and when you consider what is being shown in this fight, it's kind of obvious that Kenan should win this fight logically. So, final verdict, I am going for Kenan to win this fight, and I'm actually going to take him via KO/TKO. I think Ricky Glenn is going to be set up to get knocked out again for the 3rd time in a row, and Kenan will get that victory. For the next fight, we have Tom Nolan versus Alex Reyes. Let's go and review their stats here. Tom Nolan is 6 feet 3 inches tall with a reach of 73 inches, and he's only 24 years old. Now, on the other hand, Alex Reyes is 5 feet 11 inches tall, so he has a 4-inch height disadvantage. He has a reach of 73 inches as well, but he's 37 years old. So when it comes to striking, Nolan lands 9.26 strikes per minute with a 53% accuracy. And that is absolutely key in this matchup because Alex Reyes only lands 4.04 strikes per minute with a much lower 39% accuracy. Now, as far as grappling goes, Nolan doesn't really have any stats recorded, and neither does Alex Reyes. But when it comes to defense, Nolan absorbs 6.54 strikes per minute with a 41% striking defense and a decent takedown defense, whereas Alex Reyes absorbs 10.91 strikes per minute with a 40% striking defense and no takedown defense recorded. Now let's take a look at Tom Nolan's recent fight history. Now recently, Nolan is coming off of a win against Victor Martinez via KO/TKO, which was back in May of 2024, just a few months ago. Now Nolan's total record is 7 wins and only 1 loss. Now out of those 7 wins, 5 of them were KO/TKOs and the other 2 were decision victories, which gives him a 72% finishing rate. His only loss was a KO/TKO loss. He has 4 first-round finishes. Recently, he's done really well. He's won 4 out of his last 5 fights, and he's coming off of a win into this particular fight. His most recent win, of course, was May of 2024, and his most recent loss was in January of 2024. Now let's take a look at Alex Reyes' recent fight history. Now recently, Alex is coming off of a loss against Charlie Campbell via KO/TKO, which was back in September of 2023. Now Alex's total record is 13 wins and 4 losses, so he's lost quite a bit more than Tom Nolan. Now, out of those 13 wins, 9 of them were KO/TKOs and the other 4 were submissions. And that means that he has a 100% finish rate, which is very impressive. Now, out of his 4 losses, 3 of them were via KO/TKO and 1 was a decision loss. He does have 11 first-round finishes, so he's very aggressive early on when it comes to fights. Recently, he's won 3 out of his last 5 fights, so he's done pretty well, but he is coming off of 2 back-to-back losses into this fight. Now, his most recent win actually is all the way back in 2017. His most recent loss was in September of 2023. And let me tell you guys why there's such a gap in his fighting history. I think that this context is super important for this particular fight. Alex Reyes actually stopped fighting in 2017, and it was due to a severe health issue. He was actually diagnosed with a rare spinal infection, and it was so serious that the doctors questioned whether he would ever be able to walk again. Yes, that is absolutely insane. The condition absolutely sidelined him for several years, and it prevented him from competing within the UFC. Now, during his recovery, he also faced a lot of other setbacks, such as a torn ligament in his hand, which also delayed his return to the octagon further. Now, he made his comeback at Noche UFC back in 2023 after a 6-year hiatus, but he ended up losing that one. So that's why his most recent wins back in 2017, his most recent loss was just last year. So he's now scheduled to fight in 305, but that injury is very important to keep in mind as we're going to break down the predictions up next. I think that you guys know where this prediction is headed, but before we make it obvious, let's go ahead and review what my prediction models predicted, the weighted average, and then my final pick that takes that and also adds other non-stat based research and fight film study observations and takes everything into account. So 6 of 7 of my prediction models are leaning towards Tom Nolan, very interesting, and 1 is leaning towards Alex Reyes, and that's without even thinking of some of the qualitative factors like illnesses, injuries, and etc. So for my final prediction, I am leaning with Tom Nolan, and I'm actually going to boost his probability up a bunch. I'm going to give him an 81% probability of victory, and there's several reasons for that, not only the injury. So let's talk about it, right? Tom Nolan has a height advantage of 4 inches in this matchup. He's 13 years younger. Keep that in mind. He also lands 5.22 more strikes per minute. He has a 14% higher striking accuracy. He absorbs 4.37 less strikes per minute, and he has a slightly better striking defense as well. Not only that, but he's won 7 fights. He's finished 72% of them. He's had 2 UFC fights, and in which he's won 1 of those. He didn't win the other one, but still 2 fights in the UFC, and he has won 1 of those. Recently, he's done well. He's won 4 out of his last 5 fights, and he is coming off of a win into this fight. But let's talk about those key reasons, aside from stats alone, that really give us a well-rounded pick. Not only do I take the statistical prediction, you guys know I add research and fight film study observations and things like illnesses, injuries, momentum, all of that stuff, and I take that into account. I adjust the statistical prediction to get a more well-rounded pick, and those end up being the most accurate, around 68 to 70%, including on prelims and all of that. I think that Tom Nolan holds several advantages that will lead to his victory over Alex Reyes in this fight. Firstly, Nolan is significantly younger, which will result in better stamina and quicker recovery when it comes to fighting. He He also has a clear height and reach advantage here, and I think that that definitely will allow him to control the fight from a distance. Now, Nolan's recent performances have been pretty strong, and he's been more active in the octagon compared to his opponent, like we touched base on. And I think that some of that ring rust is going to be a key factor in this fight, as well as the injury that's really weighing his opponent down. Now, the betting odds obviously heavily favor Nolan, and I think that that's really reflecting the confidence that everyone has in his abilities to pull off this win. I think he's also fighting kind of close to his home, so he might have a bit of a hometown advantage there too, or a home crowd advantage, I should say. I also like his training. He trains at Compton Training Center, and I think that they're probably very well prepared for this fight and being able to take on Alex Reyes and defeat him. So bottom line here, I'm going with Tom Nolan here, and I'm actually going to take him via KO/TKO. I feel really bad for his opponent in this fight, but that's how the fight game goes. I think that Nolan's going to get it done. KO/TKO is the way to go for this fight. For the next fight, we have Jack Jenkins versus Herbert Burns. This should be a very good fight. Let's go and review their stats here. Jack Jenkins is 5 feet 7 inches tall with a reach of 68 inches, and he's 30 years old. Now, on the other hand, Herbert Burns is 5 feet 9 inches tall, so he has a 2-inch height advantage, and he has a reach of 73 inches, so he has a 5-inch reach advantage, but he is 36 years old, which is a big age gap, especially when you consider what 30 and 36 is in MMA. So when it comes to striking, Jack lands 4.43 strikes per minute at a 61% accuracy. Now, Herbert Burns, on the other hand, lands 1.73 strikes per minute at a 40% accuracy. As far as grappling goes, Jack Jenkins lands 2.56 takedowns on average with a 69% accuracy, whereas Herbert Burns lands 3 takedowns on average with a much less accurate 42% accuracy. And lastly, when it comes to defense, Jack Jenkins absorbs 3.07 strikes per minute with a 59% striking defense and a 75% takedown defense, whereas on the other hand, Herbert Burns absorbs 4.6 strikes per minute, so he absorbs more. And not only that, but he has a 41% striking defense, which is lower, and a 66% takedown defense, which is also lower. Now let's take a look at Jack Jenkins' recent fight history. Now recently, Jack Jenkins is coming off of a loss against Mariscal, who he just saw fight last Saturday, and he lost that fight via KO/TKO, and it was back in September of 2023. Now Jack's total record is 12 wins and 3 losses. Not a bad record overall. Out of his 12 wins, 5 of them were via KO/TKO, 3 of them were submission victories, and 4 were decision victories, which all in all gives him a 67% finishing rate. Not bad. Now, out of his 3 losses, 1 of them was a KO/TKO, 2 of them were submissions, and he has no decision losses under his belt. He has 3 first-round finishes. Recently, he's been on a tear. He's won 4 out of his last 5 fights, but he is coming off of that loss into this fight. Now, his most recent win was back in June of last year, so he hasn't been as active as I would like to see him as a fighter, and his most recent loss was in September of 2023. Now, flipping over to Herbert Burns, his recent fight history, he's coming off of a loss against Julio Arce via KO/TKO, which was back in March of 2024. Now, Burns' total record is 11 wins and 5 losses. Not a good record, honestly. Out of his 11 wins, 1 of them was a KO/TKO, 8 of them were submissions, and 2 were decision victories, which does give him a pretty good finishing rate of 82%. Out of his 5 losses, 3 of those were KO/TKOs, and 2 were decision losses. He also has 8 first-round finishes, which is good, but recently he's only won 2 out of his last 5 fights, and not only that, but he's coming off of 3 back-to-back losses into this particular fight. In fact, the most recent time he won, get this, it was back in June of 2020. We're talking peak COVID type days. And his most recent loss was back in March of 2024. This guy has not been doing well in the recent last few years. So now let's take a look at what my prediction models are predicting for this fight, their weighted average, and then my final pick that takes that and adds other non-stat based research and fight film study observations and takes all of that into account as well. 6 of 7 of my prediction models are leaning towards Jack Jenkins, and 1 is leaning towards Herbert Burns, and that's only looking at the stats. Now, when I weigh those prediction models together, I'm getting a 64.6% probability of victory for Jack Jenkins. But given all of my research outside of the stats, I'm actually going to give Jack Jenkins a even more confident 78% probability of victory, and I think that that's due to the fact that Jenkins is 6 years younger, 6 very pivotal years in his 30s younger. He lands 2.7 more strikes per minute, which is also key. He has a 21% higher striking accuracy, which is another key. He absorbs 1.5 less strikes per minute, which is a great stat. He has 18% higher striking defense, which is also a great stat. He has a 27% higher takedown accuracy, and he has a 9% higher takedown defense. He's also won 12 fights. He's finished 67% of them. He's had 3 fights in the UFC, and he's won 2 of them. That's a 67% winning rate within the UFC alone. Recently, he's won 4 out of his last 5 fights, and even though he's coming off of that 1 loss, he won 4 fights in a row before that. So now I'm going to talk about those reasons, aside from stats alone, as to why I think Jack Jenkins will defeat Herbert Burns with so much confidence this weekend. Jack Jenkins has great striking skills, very superior striking skills in this particular matchup, and I think that that's been a huge weakness for Burns when he's faced challenging opponents. Jenkins has been on a very strong run. He's won a lot of consecutive fights before that one recent loss. In fact, I think he won about 10 in a row before getting that first loss, or getting that loss after that consecutive run. Now, in contrast, Burns has been on back-to-back losses, and that has to absolutely crush your confidence as a fighter and crush your momentum. Not only that, but I believe he lost his last 3 fights by KO/TKO, very dominant, unfortunately, and I think that that just kind of highlights his defensive vulnerabilities. I don't think he's a very, not only do I think that he's not a very good striker, but his defense is atrocious, if I'm being honest. Now, I think that the fight also being in Australia is going to give Jenkins a bit of that motivation and home crowd advantage that we've talked about some of those fighters earlier on in this card. So that's going to be another key factor in this fight. I will also say Burns has kind of struggled against some of those stronger striker type fighters, and that's exactly where Jenkins excels. He's really, really good with the striking. Not only that, but Jenkins does have better physical conditioning overall, and he even has a longer average fight time compared to Burns. And I think that that just kind of highlights his superior endurance as a fighter. So after returning, after like an 11-month break or whatever, Jenkins, I think he's going to be very highly motivated to prove himself and bounce back. Sorry for taking so long on these fights and really just taking my time and breaking things down. You guys know I love talking about fights, and I could talk about these fights all day long. But sorry, I'll wrap it up here. So the last thing I'm going to note is that I really like Jenkins's ability to fight standing up, and I think that he's going to be able to neutralize Burns's grappling advantage because of his strong striking advantage. I think that every time Burns is going to try to grapple, he's going to be pretty much shut down from Jenkins. So final verdict here, I think that Jenkins, given Burns's really bad defense and his back-to-back losses in the fashion that we've seen, I think I'm leaning towards a Jack Jenkins KO/TKO. I think Burns is going to fall to the canvas. I think Jenkins is getting this victory. Final verdict, Jack Jenkins via KO/TKO. That's the move for this fight. Now for the next fight, we have Josh Culibao versus Ricardo Ramos. This is a good fight. Now let's go and review their stats here. Josh Culibao is 5 feet 10 inches tall with a reach of 73 inches, and he's 30 years old. Now on the other hand, Ricardo Ramos is 5 feet 9 inches tall, so he's 1 inch shorter. He has a reach of 72 inches, so he has a 1 inch shorter reach. And he's 29 years old, so he's 1 year younger. Now, when it comes to striking, Josh lands 3.2 strikes per minute with a 42% accuracy. And Ricardo, on the other hand, lands 3.21 strikes per minute with a 37% accuracy. As far as grappling goes, Josh doesn't really have anything recorded, and Ricardo Ramos, on the other hand, he does. He lands 3.02 takedowns on average with a 60% accuracy. And lastly, when it comes to the defense, Josh Culibao absorbs 3.24 strikes per minute with a 56% striking defense and a 67% takedown defense, whereas Ricardo Ramos, on the other hand, he absorbs 3.74 strikes per minute with a 57% striking defense and a slightly better 72% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Josh Culibao's recent fight history. Now recently, Josh is coming off of that loss against Danny Silva, which was via split decision back in March of this year. His total record currently is 11 wins and 3 losses. Not bad overall. Now, out of those 11 wins, 5 of them were via KO/TKO, 1 of them was a submission victory, and 5 were decision victories, which does give him a 55% finishing rate. But I like how this kid fights. I mean, I've seen his fights, and overall, I do like him as a fighter. Now, out of his 3 losses, 1 of them was a KO/TKO, and 2 were decision losses. Now, he does have 3 first-round finishes. Recently, he's won 3 out of his last 5 fights, but he is coming off of back-to-back losses, which is a key stat to keep in mind when it comes to momentum and how he's doing psychologically coming into this fight. Now, his most recent win was back in February of 2023, and his most recent loss was back in March, but again, that loss was a split decision loss. Now let's take a look at Ricardo Ramos' recent fight history. Now recently, Ricardo is coming off of a loss as well against Julian Erosa, which was via submission back in March of this year. Now his total record is 16 wins and 6 losses, which is kind of a mediocre record overall. Now out of his 16 wins, 4 of those were KO/TKOs, 7 of them were submissions, and 5 were decision victories, which does give him a pretty respectable 69% finishing rate. Now out of his 6 losses, 2 of those were via KO/TKO, 3 of those losses were submissions, and 1 was a decision loss. He has 8 first-round finishes, which is great, but recently he's only won 2 out of his last 5 fights. Not so great, and he's on back-to-back losses coming into this fight. He's on a 2-fight losing streak. His most recent win was back in June of 2022. That is not good. It's been a while since his most recent win, and his most recent loss was back in March of this year. Now let's take a look at what my prediction models predicted, their weighted average, and my final pick that takes that and adds other non-stat based research and fight film study observations, takes all of that into account as well. 2 of 7 of my prediction models are leaning towards Josh Culibao, and 5 are leaning towards Ricardo Ramos. And when I weigh those prediction models together, I'm getting a 51.4% probability victory for Josh Culibao. Now for my final prediction, I'm going to bump that up. I'm giving Josh a confident 58% probability of victory, and that's due to the fact that Josh does have a height advantage of an inch here. He has a reach advantage of an inch. He has a 5% better striking accuracy, and he absorbs 0.5 less strikes per minute as well. Josh has won 11 fights. He's finished 55% of them. He's had 7 UFC fights, of which he's only won 3, but he's done very well in majority of his fights. I like how this kid fights. And recently, he's won 3 out of his last 5 fights, so he's done well overall. I like his fighting style. He has grit. He's tough. He's durable. Now, Not only am I going to talk about all those stats on paper that we just discussed, but now I'm going to get in depth a little bit as to why I think Josh will win this fight against Ricardo Ramos. I will say that even though recently he's faced a couple losses here and there, it's not as though he was getting finished in those particular losses. What we've seen through Josh Culibao is his ability to endure some of those tough fights and stay in the fight. It doesn't really seem like he's getting completely dominated in fights. He's still giving it his all, and he's doing pretty well throughout these fights, even through his losses. And I think that that really speaks to this kid's skills. Now, physically, I think that he also, of course, he has that height and reach advantage, which will probably play a bit of a role in striking exchanges. It's only an inch on each, but still, it's going to play a bit of a role here. I will also say that I really like the experience that Culibao has when it comes to the opponents that he's faced. I think he's faced tougher opponents generally than Ricardo Ramos, and I think that that's really prepared him for this particular fight. He also trains at Igor MMA Academy, which is really known for their comprehensive training, and I think that that will feed into his readiness for this fight as well. Ricardo, he just seems like he's the weaker fighter in this matchup, not only statistically, but stylistically. I do like that Josh is very consistent when it comes to his performances in this division, and he's a well-conditioned fighter. You know, he doesn't really seem like the leanest, cleanest, most muscular guy, but he is pretty well conditioned overall. I will say that I like his conditioning. Now, additionally, he is a mentally resilient fighter. He's a tough kid. So I think that his rebounding from some of his losses and his need to continue his victories in the UFC are going to overcome anything that Ricardo Ramos will try to attempt. I think that Josh controls this fight, takes it to the judges, and gets the unanimous decision victory. I don't see him necessarily finishing Ricardo Ramos, but I can expect Josh to use his striking and use his technical skills and combine all of that with his endurance to take the fight to the judges and eke out a unanimous decision victory. For the next fight, we have some of the big guys. We have Junior Tafa versus Valter Walker. Let's go and review their stats here. Junior Tafa is 6 feet 3 inches tall with a reach of 75 inches, and he's 27 years old. Now, on the other hand, Valter Walker is 6 feet 6 inches tall, which is 3 inches taller than Tafa. He has a reach of 78 inches, so he has a 3-inch longer reach than Tafa does, and he's 26 years old, so he's a year younger. Now, before we get into these fighting stats, I do want to give you guys a disclaimer and let you guys know that Valter Walker's stats come from only one fight, which is going to be very important when I'm about to break down these stats for you guys. So when it comes to striking, Junior Tafa lands 1.81 strikes per minute with a 40% accuracy. Now, Valter Walker, on the other hand, he lands 2.2 strikes per minute with a 49% accuracy. Now, as far as grappling goes, Junior Tafa doesn't really have anything recorded, but Valter Walker does. He lands 4 takedowns on average with an 80% accuracy. And again, his stats are coming from only one fight. That's where, that context is really important for me to give you guys. Now, lastly, when it comes to defense, Junior Tafa absorbs 1.86 strikes per minute with a 50% striking defense and an 81% takedown defense, whereas on the other hand, Valter Walker absorbs 3.87 strikes per minute with a 43% striking defense, and he does not have takedown defense recorded. Now let's take a look at Junior Tafa's recent fight history. Now recently, Tafa is coming off of a loss against Marcos Rogerio de Lima, which was via KO/TKO back in February of 2024. His total record, 5 wins and 2 losses. Now out of those 5 wins, all 5 were via KO/TKO, which does give him a 100% finishing rate. Now, out of his 2 losses, one of them was a KO/TKO and the other was a decision loss. He does have 4 first round finishes out of his 5 wins. Recently, he's won 3 out of his last 5 fights, but he is coming off of that loss into this fight. And how he's going to perform after being knocked out, we have to see. Now, his most recent win was back in August of 2023. His most recent loss was in February of this year. Now, on the other hand, we have Valter Walker. Let's take a look at his recent fight history. Now, recently, he's coming off of that loss against Lucas Bresky via unanimous decision, which was back in April of 2024, just a few months ago. Now, Walker's total record is 11 wins and only 1 loss. Out of those 11 wins, 6 of them were KO/TKOs, 1 was a submission victory, and 4 were decision victories, which gives him a 64% finishing rate. Now, out of his 1 loss, that loss was a decision loss. His most recent win was back in June of 2023, and his most recent loss was back in April of 2024. Now let's take a look at what my prediction models predicted for this fight, their weighted average, and then my final pick that takes that and also adds other non-stat based research and fight film study observations, takes all of that into account as well. 4 of 7 of my prediction models are leaning towards Junior Tafa and 3 are leaning towards Valter Walker. And when I weigh those prediction models together, I'm getting a 53% probability victory for Junior Tafa. Now for my final prediction, I'm going to knock that down ever so slightly. I mean, almost unnoticeably, but I'm knocking that down to a 51% probability victory for Tafa. And that's due to the fact that Valter Walker, he does have a height advantage here of 3 inches. He is the slightly younger fighter. He has a reach advantage of 3 inches and he lands 0.39 more strikes per minute. And also he has a 9% higher striking accuracy. So he has a few things going for him that, in my opinion, are going to make this fight a little bit more 50-50. But the reason that I am leaning towards Tafa is due to the fact that Tafa absorbs 2 less strikes per minute. He has a 7% higher striking defense as well. He's won 5 fights. He's finished 100% of them. So stay out of this guy's way. He's had 3 UFC fights, of which he's won 1, but he's done well overall in his career so far. He's recently won 3 out of his last 5 fights. But let's talk about those reasons aside from stats alone as to why Tafa can defeat Valter Walker in this fight. Here's the thing, Tafa is a very dangerous and aggressive opponent, and that could spell some trouble for Valter Walker. But not only is Tafa a very powerful striker, he's also very good with his striking accuracy and even his counter-striking ability. If you look at some of his previous fights, I love the way that this guy counters. I think that a lot of his ability to land some of those significant strikes comes from his counter-striking ability. That's at least what I picked up from watching his fight film footage. Now, he's also had a couple of good experiences when it comes to high pressure fights, and he's displayed some strong defensive skills as well. I think that Tafa can avoid takedowns, and he can maintain his striking advantage throughout this fight. I like Tafa's overall fight IQ as a fighter. Honestly, what this fight boils down to is a combination of power, skill, and strategy, and I think that Tafa has all 3, and that's going to position him well for a victory in this particular matchup. I'm going to take Junior Tafa via KO/TKO. I think it's going to be electric, explosive. We're all going to love it. I'm expecting fireworks out of him, and I hope I don't get disappointed here. But we'll see how Tafa feels after being knocked out. That's going to be kind of key, or facing that KO/TKO. So that's going to be interesting, but I'm still leaning towards a Tafa KO/TKO bottom line. Now for the next fight, we have Jingliang versus Carlos Prates. I'm a huge fan of Lee. I like his fighting style. He's aggressive. He also has this kind of a crazy look to him, and that just, it goes really well for this business. Anyways, let's talk some stats here. Lee is 6 feet tall with a reach of 71 inches, and he's 36 years old. Now, on the other hand, Carlos is 6 feet 1 inch tall, so he has a 1 inch height advantage, but he has a reach of 78 inches, and that's pretty crucial. He has a 7-inch reach advantage over Lee. He's also 30 years old, so he's 6 years younger, and again, 30 and 36 is a huge difference in MMA. Now, when it comes to striking, Lee lands 4.46 strikes per minute with a 42% accuracy. And Carlos, on the other hand, he lands 4.09 strikes per minute with a 52% accuracy. Now, as far as grappling goes, Lee lands 1.25 takedowns on average with a 41% accuracy, and Carlos, on the other hand, he doesn't have any takedown stats recorded. Lastly, when it comes to defense, Lee absorbs 3.84 strikes per minute with a 57% striking defense and a 60% takedown defense, whereas Carlos, he absorbs 5.23 strikes per minute with a 39% striking defense, but a better 80% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Lee's recent fight history. Now recently, Lee is coming off of that loss against Daniel Rodriguez via split decision, which was back in September of 2022. Now his total record is 19 wins and 8 losses. I actually didn't realize how long it's been since we've seen Lee in the octagon. I'm surprised it was all the way back in 2022, but I'm glad he's back and we're going to get to see him again here. Now out of his 19 wins, 10 of those were via KO/TKO, 4 of those were via submission, and 5 were decision victories, which is a lot of really good experience, and it gives him a 74% finishing rate. Now, out of his 8 losses, 2 of them were submissions and 6 were decision losses. Now, Lee does have 7 first-round finishes. Recently, though, he's only won 2 out of his last 5 fights, and he's coming off of a loss into this fight. The most recent time that he won was back in July of 2022, and the most recent time he lost was in September of 2022. Now, the reason that Jingliang did not fight recently, I went ahead and researched this for you guys. He had a spine injury that he dealt with during training for a scheduled fight against Michael Chiesa back at UFC 287. Now, that injury was a result of accumulated stress from very rigorous training, particularly in BJJ and wrestling, which led to a herniated disc and spinal cord compression. Now, that injury ended up forcing him to withdraw from that fight and take a bunch of time to recover. And since then, I mean, Lee has been very open about his injury. He's shared a lot of the details on social media. I was able to find all of that. And he's also kind of spoken about the pain that he's faced and the impact that it had on his fight's preparation. Now, despite this crazy injury, which some doctors suggested might even require surgery, Jingliang opted for non-surgical recovery as his approach to recover. Now, since then, he's been focused on healing and rehabilitation, and he's been aiming to return to the octagon fully recovered this weekend. And I think that that's absolutely key to keep in mind as we're about to make our predictions after reviewing Carlos Prates' recent fight history. So speaking of which, let's talk about Carlos Prates' recent fight history. Now, recently, he's coming off of a win against Charles Radke via KO/TKO, and that was back in June of this year, just 1 or 2 months ago. Now, his total record is 19 wins and 6 losses. Out of those 19 wins, 14 of them were KO/TKOs, 3 of them were submissions, and only 2 were decision victories, which does give him a very impressive 90% finishing rate on top of a bunch of experience. Now, out of his 6 losses, 2 of them were KO/TKOs, 3 of them were submissions, and 1 was a decision loss. He does have 8 first-round finishes. Recently, he's won all 5 of his last 5 fights. In fact, he's actually on a 9-fight win streak. His most recent win was back in June of 2024. His most recent loss was back in June of 2019. Now let's take a look at what my prediction models predicted for this fight, their weighted average, and then my final pick that takes that and adds other non-stat based research and fight film study observations and takes that into account as well. 4 of 7 of my prediction models here are leaning towards Lee and 3 are leaning towards Carlos. And when I weigh those prediction models together, however, I'm getting a 53% probability victory for Carlos based on the weights of each of those models. Now for my final prediction here, I'm giving Carlos a more confident 65% probability victory. That's due to the fact that the stats are not picking up things like injuries, momentum, age's impact, relative to what stage these guys are on their fighting careers. And I'll speak a little bit more about all of that stuff. But first, let's talk statistical advantages here. So I'm giving Carlos a 65% probability of victory. Carlos does have a height advantage of 1 inch. He's 6 years younger. He has a reach advantage of 7 inches, which will be pivotal in this fight. He has a 10% higher striking accuracy and a 20% higher takedown defense. He's won 19 fights. He's finished 90% of those. He's had 2 UFC fights and he's won both of those. And recently he's on a 9-fight win streak. But let's talk about those reasons aside from stats alone as to why Carlos can defeat Jingliang. So I think that Carlos being on that 9-fight win streak and those 8 wins being by knockout really just highlights the striking power that this particular fighter has. I like his momentum and his confidence, and I think that they are very, very high coming into this fight due to his recent active competition and his wins. Now, in contrast, on the other hand, like we discussed, Lee has been out of action for nearly 2 years due to all the injuries that he's been dealing with and facing. He didn't get surgery, but we don't know what kind of impact that has on his body and if he's 100%. He's also 36 years old, so his body's not going to recover the same way that a 26-year-old might, you know? So I think that that is going to affect him in the sense of ring rust, dealing with that injury, and that's going to inevitably bleed into his performance a little bit. Jingliang, that spine injury, I think that that's going to impact his physical condition. No matter what he tries to do, he's just not going to be that same fighter. Now, Prates, it's a completely different story with Prates. I like his experience against some of those tough opponents that he's faced, even in some of those other organizations that we've seen. If you do your research, he's done pretty well against some of those guys on those scenes that are of higher level competition. I like his striking ability, and I think that that's going to be a significant threat in this fight, especially if you consider that Jingliang's defense could be compromised based on his injury. The last thing that I'll say is that Prates' active competition and his recent successes are very likely giving him a psychological edge over Jingliang, who will be a little bit concerned about his overall physical health and whether he can still get it done. These fighters are not too different than regular people in the sense of what they think. Now, they go through a lot, they train themselves, and they have discipline, they have mental resilience, but human nature is human nature. He's gonna go in there probably doubting himself just a little bit, being 36 and on this stage of his career. So bottom line here, not to get too in depth or too philosophical or psychological, I'm going with Carlos Prates here, and I think that he's unfortunately going to knock out Lee. I do like Lee as a fighter. I think he's a cool guy. I like his suits. If you guys remember all that drama going on with him getting a suit and not being able to wear it and all that stuff, I like the guy. You know, he's a pretty good fighter. He's aggressive. He was here during COVID times. He kept us entertained when all other sports were shut down and all that stuff. But I am, bottom line, going for Carlos Prates in this fight via KO/TKO. For the next fight, we have the big boys. We have Tuivasa versus Jairzinho Rozenstruik. Let's go and review their stats here. Tuivasa, 6 feet 2 inches tall with a reach of 75 inches, and he's 31 years old. Sometimes I forget that Tuivasa is kind of on the younger side. He's only 31 years old. Now, on the other hand, Jairzinho Rozenstruik, he's 6 feet 2 inches tall as well, but he has a 3-inch better reach of 78 inches, and he's 36 years old. He's 5 years older than Tuivasa. Now, when it comes to striking, Tuivasa lands 3.96 strikes per minute with a 49% accuracy. Now, Rozenstruik, on the other hand, he lands 3.44 strikes per minute at a 49% accuracy as well. So he lands just a little bit less strikes per minute, but with the same accuracy. Now, as far as grappling goes, Ty doesn't really have any takedown stats recorded. Now, Rozenstruik, he also doesn't have any takedown stats recorded. But when it comes to defense, Tuivasa observes 5.05 strikes per minute with a 43% striking defense and a 57% takedown defense, whereas Rozenstruik absorbs 2.78 strikes per minute with a 47% striking defense and a 75% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Tuivasa's recent fight history. Now recently, Ty is coming off of a loss against Marcin Tybura, who we just saw fight last week, and that is via submission, which was back in March of this year. Now, Tuivasa's total record is 15 wins and 7 losses. Not the best record, but he did do well, a few years ago. Recently, not too well. Out of his 15 wins, 14 of them were KO/TKOs. One of them was a decision victory, which gives him a really high 93.4% finishing rate. Now, out of his 7 losses, 3 of them were KO/TKO losses, 3 of them were submission losses, and 1 was a decision loss. Now, Tuivasa is a very all or nothing, round one or nothing type of fighter. He's had 12 first round finishes. Recently, though, he has not done well. Like I said, he's only won 1 out of his last 5 fights. I want you to keep that in mind. In fact, he's on a losing streak. He's on a 4-fight losing streak. The most recent win he had was actually all the way back in 2022, and his most recent loss was in March of 2024. Now, Rozenstruik is a different story. Speaking of which, let's take a look at Rozenstruik's recent fight history. Now, Rozenstruik is coming off of a win against Shamil Gaziev, which was pretty recent. That was back in March of 2024, and that was via KO/TKO. Now, Rozenstruik, his total record is 14 wins and 5 losses. Out of those 14 wins, 13 of them were KO/TKOs, and only one of them was a decision victory, which gives him a very high 93% finish rate. Now, out of his 5 losses, 2 of them were KO/TKOs, 1 was via submission, and 2 were decision losses. He has 9 first-round finishes. Recently, he hasn't done too well, but he's done better than Tai. He's won 2 out of his last 5 fights, and he is coming off of a win into this fight. The most recent time he won was back in March of 2024. The most recent time he lost was back in May of 2023. Now let's take a look at what my prediction models predicted for this fight. Their weighted average and my final pick that takes that and also adds other non-stat based research and fight film study observations, takes all of that good stuff into account as well. Surprise, surprise, none of my prediction models are leaning towards Tai Tuivasa, and all 7 are leaning towards Rozenstruik. And when I weigh those together, I'm getting a 63% probability of victory for Rozenstruik to win. Now, as I'm doing research outside of statistics and I'm watching these guys' previous fights, I actually kind of agreed with the statistical models here, and I'm keeping it within that range. I think that Rozenstruik, he's going to get it done, and 63% is pretty fair. He has a reach advantage of 3 inches. He absorbs 2.27 less strikes per minute. He has a 4% higher striking defense, and he has an 18% higher takedown defense. Not only that, but Rozenstruik has won 14 fights. He's finished 93% of them, and he's had 13 UFC fights, of which he's won 8 of those. So that's a pretty good winning percentage and good amount of experience within the UFC. He's proven himself quite a few times, especially earlier in his career. So he is coming off of a win into this fight, but let's talk about those reasons aside from stats alone as to why Rozenstruik will likely defeat Tai Tuivasa. So he has a 3-inch reach advantage, which I think is going to allow him to strike from a bit of a safer distance compared to Tai Tuivasa. And I think that his superior defense skill, it's going to allow him to absorb fewer strikes than Tai Tuivasa will. Tai Tuivasa, I mean, he's not the most technical striker. If you've seen him, he likes to swing a lot. I think Rozenstruik has the reach that he's going to need to keep this a bit of a rangy but aggressive style of a fight. Now, Rozenstruik, he kind of uses a little bit of a technical kickboxing skill set, and recently that's done him pretty well. He's won 2 of his last 3 fights, which suggests that he's been doing pretty decent. Now, I will also say that he does have a little bit better stamina, in my opinion, than Tai Tuivasa does. So if this fight does end up going beyond the initial minutes, which, I mean, the odds are against that, but even if it does, I really like Rozenstruik as a fighter compared to Tuivasa in that scenario. Now, Rozenstruik is also very elusive as a fighter, believe it or not. Don't just go off of these guys' bodies, but these guys have skills, I promise you. I like Rozenstruik's elusiveness as a fighter. I think that he's going to use his jabs effectively. He's going to use those leg kicks, and that's going to frustrate Tuivasa, and that's going to make him very hard to be able to be cleanly hit. Now, I will say that Tuivasa is fighting in his home country, and that's going to add a lot of pressure on Tuivasa. He's going to have that home crowd support, but can he break out of his slump and beat Rozenstruik? I just don't think that that's very logical. I don't see that happening, if I'm being honest with you guys. So the last thing that I'll say about this fight is that Rozenstruik has good experience against some of those top fighters. Recently he's done better, and I think that all things considered, he's going to have more of an edge in this fight than Tuivasa will. So because of that, I'm going to take Rozenstruik via KO/TKO, very likely in round 1, could be in round 2 as well, but very likely in round 1. He's going to keep the range, frustrate Tuivasa. He's not going to get hit as much as Tuivasa is going to try to attempt, but he's going to hit at the same time. He's going to land on Tuivasa, and eventually he's going to set up for a proper swing, and that's going to end up dropping Tuivasa. That's how I see this going. I like Tai Tuivasa. I think he's a people's champ. Everyone loves him. Power to him. But if I'm speaking strictly off of logic, which is all I will ever go off of, I don't want to make an emotional pick. I want to give you guys logic here and a good thorough analysis. Rozenstruik is the way to go via KO/TKO. For the next fight, we have Mateusz Gamrot versus Dan Hooker. This will be a great fight. Honestly, I really like this card. I'm excited for 305. I like the card, and I like the fighters that are on this card. So let's review these guys' stats. Mateusz Gamrot is 5 feet 10 inches tall with a reach of 70 inches, and he's 33 years old. Now, on the other hand, Dan Hooker is 6 feet tall. He's 2 inches taller. He has a reach of 75 inches. He has a 5-inch longer reach, and he's 34 years old, so he's 1 year older. When it comes to striking, Mateusz lands 3.09 strikes per minute with a 51% accuracy. Now, Dan, on the other hand, he lands 5.08 strikes per minute with a 48% accuracy. So around the same accuracy, but about 2 more strikes per minute. Now, as far as grappling goes, Mateusz lands 5.28 takedowns on average with a 35% accuracy. Now, Dan, on the other hand, he's not big on the takedowns. He only lands 0.79 takedowns on average, but with the same accuracy roughly at 34%. Now, lastly, when it comes to defense, Gamrot absorbs 3.07 strikes per minute with a 59% striking defense and a 90% takedown defense, whereas Dan absorbs 4.76 strikes per minute with a 51% striking defense and an 80% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Gamrot's recent fight history. Now, Gamrot is coming off of that win against Rafael dos Anjos RDA, which was via unanimous decision back in March of 2024. Now, Gamrot's total record is 24 wins and only 2 losses. Sometimes it's easy to forget how dominant Gamrot is. Out of those 24 wins, 8 of them were via KO/TKO, 5 of them were via submissions, and 11 were decision victories, which gives him a 54% finish rate, but the guy is crazy good and versatile, and he's able to control fights. Now, out of his 2 losses, both of those were decision losses, so sometimes the fight can kind of get away from him. So Gamrot, he does have 3 first-round finishes. He's not huge on finishing and looking for the finish immediately. He's more about controlling the fight where he needs to and strategically adapting. Recently, he's won 4 out of his last 5 fights, and he is coming off of 3 back-to-back wins coming into this fight, so he's carrying a lot of momentum on his side. His most recent win was back in March of 2024. His most recent loss was back in October of 2022. Now, on the other side, we have Dan Hooker. Now, Dan is coming off of a win against Jalen Turner, which was via split decision back in July of 2023. His total record is 23 wins and 12 losses. Out of those 23 wins, 11 of them were KO/TKO, 7 of them were submissions, and 5 were decision victories, which gives him a 78.3% finishing rate. Now, I wouldn't go strictly based off this record to judge this guy. If you've seen some of his previous fights, he's an absolute beast. I mean, look at his fight with Dustin Poirier, and you'll see that this kid does have a lot of talent. It just seems to be that he's in a bit of a slump, perhaps. Now, out of his 12 losses, 3 of them were KO/TKOs, 3 of them were submissions, and 6 were decision losses. He has 12 first-round finishes. Recently, he's had 3 wins out of his last 5 fights, but he is coming off of 2 back-to-back wins, so he's starting to kind of get out of that slump and continue making a name for himself. His most recent win was back in July of last year. His most recent loss was in March of 2022, so it's been a little bit. This one was pretty tough for me, man. I really like Dan Hooker, but I had to do it. So let's look at my prediction models, what they predicted, their weighted average, and then my final pick that takes that and also incorporates other non-stat based research and fight film study observations, takes those into account as well. Now, the statistical models, they are machine learning models, data science models. They are leaning towards Mateusz Gamrot, 6 out of 7 of them, and only 1 is leaning towards Dan Hooker. Now, when I weigh those prediction models together, I'm getting a 55.4% probability of victory for Gamrot. Now, for my final prediction, which incorporates all my research and stuff outside of statistics like fight film studying and all of that, momentum, fight IQ, counter-striking skills, taking all of that stuff that statistics can't consider alone, when I look at all that stuff, I'm going to adjust and give Gamrot a more confident 67% probability of victory. And I think that Gamrot, not only is he the younger fighter, not only does he have a better striking accuracy, he absorbs 1.7 less strikes per minute. He has a 8% higher striking defense. He lands 4.5 more takedowns on average. He has a better takedown accuracy and a 10% higher takedown defense. He's won 24 fights and he's only lost 2 of them. He's finished 54% of his fights. He's had 9 fights in the UFC, of which he's won 7 of those. He's won 4 out of his last 5 fights, and he's coming off of 3 back-to-back wins in this particular fight. Last time he lost was all the way back in 2022, but let's talk about those reasons aside from statistical as to why Gamrot will likely defeat Dan Hooker. Honestly, it boils down to his superior wrestling and his high-level grappling skills. I think that's going to allow him to control the fight when it comes to the ground, and that's a huge area where we've seen Dan Hooker struggle. So Gamrot, he has better grappling and takedown abilities and superior wrestling, and that's going to be a key factor against Dan Hooker's fighting style. Now, Gamrot also has really good cardio, and that's going to allow him to maintain a very high pace in this fight. And I could kind of see him exhausting Hooker a little bit as the fight goes on. Hooker's not bad when it comes to his overall endurance, but Gamrot's just way better when it comes to his endurance. Also, I will say that Gamrot does have really good versatility, and he's able to adapt when it comes to fighting, and that can kind of be this kryptonite for Hooker, who has a little bit more of a predictive style. If you see all of his fights, you can kind of, he's a basic fighter. Even though he's done really well with it throughout his fighting career, he's still a very basic fighter who is predictable more times than he's not. Gamrot's a little bit better when it comes to all of that. Now, additionally, I will say I like Gamrot's winning streak, and I think that, of course, psychologically, that's going to add to his confidence and his momentum. I really like his fight IQ. I want to highlight that. His fight IQ is really high, and that's going to allow him to make a lot of strategic adjustments in this fight, while his striking defense will probably neutralize Hooker's offensive capabilities. Now, finally, I will say Gamrot, he's a top contender in this division, and he's highly motivated to win and continue to advance in the rankings and possibly work his way towards a title shot. He has a lot going for him. I think he's going to get the victory here and continue his chase for the title. Give me Gamrot via decision. That is the bottom line for this fight. I don't see him getting a finish. He doesn't have the best finishing rate, but if it's about control, I think that Gamrot can easily control this fight, take it to the judges, and get a victory. For the next fight, we have our co-main event for UFC 305. We made it. It's Kai Kara-France versus Steve Erceg, aka Michael Scott from The Office. Let's go ahead and get started here. Kai Kara-France is 5 feet 4 inches tall with a reach of 69 inches, and he's 31 years old. Now, on the other hand, Steve is 5 feet 8 inches tall, so he has a 4-inch height advantage, which is pretty big. Now, he does have a 1-inch reach disadvantage, and he's 29 years old, so he's 2 years younger than Kai. Now, when it comes to striking, Kai Kara-France, he lands 4.57 strikes per minute with a 39% accuracy. Now, Steve, on the other hand, this is very interesting. Steve lands 4.52 strikes per minute, very similar to Kai, but at a 10% better striking accuracy of 49%. Now, as far as grappling goes, Kai Kara-France lands 0.63 takedowns on average with a 33% accuracy. And here's the other thing. Steve, he lands 1.23 takedowns on average. That's about twice as much, with a slightly less accuracy, but still lands twice as many. Now, lastly, when it comes to defense, Kai absorbs 3.24 strikes per minute with a 65% striking defense and an 88% takedown defense, whereas Steve absorbs 4.2 strikes per minute with a 52% striking defense and a 60% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Kai Kara-France's recent fight history. Now, recently, Kai is coming off of that loss against Amir Albazi, which was via split decision back in June of 2023. Now, Kai's total record is 24 wins and 11 losses, and out of those 24 wins, 11 of them were KO/TKOs, 3 of them were submissions, and 10 were decision victories, which gives him a 58% finishing rate. Out of his 11 losses, 3 of those were via KO/TKO, 3 were submissions, and 5 were decision losses. He does have 12 first-round finishes, which is impressive. Recently, he's won 3 out of his last 5 fights. He's not doing too bad, but even more recently, he's coming off of back-to-back losses into this fight against Steve, who we previously saw had a really good performance, but we'll touch base more on that in a little bit. Now, Kai's most recent win was back in March of 2022, which that's huge. He hasn't won since March of 2022. Keep that in mind. His most recent loss was back in June of 2023. Now let's take a look at Steve Erceg's recent fight history. Now, recently, Steve is coming off of a loss against Alexander Pantoja via unanimous decision, which was back in May of 2024. But let me ask you guys, was that really a loss? Who actually lost that fight? Pantoja won on paper, and Pantoja did good. Don't get me wrong. Pantoja did real good. But Steve Erceg was the winner of that night. And I don't mean the winner based on who actually won, but he did really, really well against Alexander Pantoja. And I think he was ranked like number 11 in that fight. I need to go back and check that, but he was ranked pretty low against a guy like Alexander Pantoja, the champion. He was kind of given this crazy opportunity, and he did really, really well with it. And I think that more than that dissing Alexander Pantoja's skill, I think that really highlights the skill and potential that Steve Erceg has as a fighter. And I know I'm only supposed to be covering his record here, and I'm getting a little carried away. We'll talk a little more about this as I get into the predictions, but that's just something to keep in mind here. I don't want you guys to think that he's coming off of a loss into this fight. That was a really, really good performance. So let me center myself and get back on point here. Erceg's total record, 12 wins and only 2 losses, of which one, in my opinion, could be considered invalid. Now, out of those 12 wins, 2 of them were KO/TKOs, 6 of them were submissions, and 4 were decision victories, which just gave him a 67% finishing rate. He has had 2 losses, both of those were decision losses, so he has not been finished. Steve, he also has 5 first-round finishes. Recently, he's won 4 out of his last 5 fights, and he's currently on that 1-fight losing streak, which was a really, really good performance against a champion. So Steve's most recent win was back in March of 2024. His most recent loss was in May of 2024. So not only does he win in March, he bounces back, faces a champion, does extremely well, almost equivalent of the champion, but the champion just ekes out a victory there, but he still does really, really good. Steve Erceg, he's kind of one of those fighters that flies under the radar. Not a lot of people know about him or talk about him, but now he's being talked about after that Pantoja performance. And if you're new to UFC, and if you're just trying to tune into 305, get some context information, I highly advise you rewatch that Pantoja fight. That's going to tell you everything you need to know about this co-main event. Now let's take a look at what my prediction models predicted for this fight. Their weighted average, and then my final pick that takes that and adds other non-stat based research and fight film study observations as well. 6 of 7 of my prediction models are leaning towards Kai Kara-France, and only 1 is leaning towards Steve. Now this is very interesting. When I weigh those prediction models together, I'm getting a 60.8% probability of victory for Kai Kara-France. However, for several reasons, specifically qualitative reasons that statistical models can't immediately pick up, I'm actually going to go opposite of the prediction models here. I'm going to fight the prediction models. I'm going for Steve Erceg, and I'm going to flip the script and give him a 59.2% probability of victory. And there's several reasons for that, but first let's talk about stats. Steve has a height advantage of 4 inches in this matchup. He's 2 years younger. He has a 10% better striking accuracy like we discussed earlier, and he lands 0.61 more takedowns on average. Twice as many, by the way. Steve has won 12 fights. He's finished 67% of them. He's won 3 of his 4 UFC fights. Now, I know this guy has flown under everybody's radar, or a majority of everybody's radar. But guess what? He's had 4 UFC fights, of which he's won 3. He has a 75% winning rate in the UFC as he climbs the rankings and as he faces the champion. In fact, the only UFC fight he's lost was that championship level fight against Pantoja. How unfair is that? That's not even technically a loss in my opinion. Now recently he's won 4 out of his last 5 fights. Sorry for being so passionate about this. Let me tone it down a little bit. But let's talk about those reasons aside from stats alone as to why Steve is going to defeat Kai Kara-France. First, let's talk about Steve's dynamic skill set. I think that Erceg, he has this crazy dynamic skill set that will give him an edge when it comes to versatility and striking against an opponent like Kai Kara-France. His recent performance against Pantoja, I'm always going to highlight that because we can tell the most about a fighter based on his most recent performance, especially when it comes to improvements, potential, so on and so forth. Now, despite that being a loss, like I said, that was very impressive, and he showed very high-level capabilities, especially in striking. Also keep in mind, Steve will be fighting in his hometown of Perth, and I think that that's going to give him a lot of local support, which will boost his morale as he's riding this wave of confidence from that fight. I mean, think of it this way. Think of yourself as a fighter. You're fighting in the main event. You just fought 2 months ago. Now you're fighting the champion, and you actually go toe-to-toe against the champion and almost do equally as good as Pantoja. That's very impressive. I want you guys to really internalize that and think that through when you're coming up with who's going to win. A lot of people are just jumping on Kai Kara-France, but you really have to think of qualitative factors as to why Steve Erceg is likely going to win. So continuing my case here, I think that Erceg is very motivated. He's going to redeem himself after that very narrow loss to Pantoja. He's 28. He's a little bit younger and probably a little more resilient than Kai Kara-France, who is returning after not fighting for a while. And again, Kai Kara-France hasn't won in a while either. I really like Steve Erceg and his overall strategic approach to fighting. He utilizes what he has very, very well. He has a great fight IQ. He's kind of like the Manu Ginobili of UFC. I don't know if you guys watch basketball a lot, but Manu Ginobili, he's a guy who played for the San Antonio Spurs. The guy, he wasn't a great looking guy. He wasn't crazy athletic or anything when it came to his appearance. But when it came to the court, the guy was insanely talented. And I think Erceg is a lot like that. He flies under the radar. He looks like your everyday accountant type. No insults to accountants. Like, we all need accountants. But Erceg is just that guy who gets the job done. He uses what he has very, very well. He flies under the radar. And he's climbing the rankings. I mean, he's dangerous. He's a dangerous fighter. You might not look it, but he is. So I think he has a great strategic approach, great fight IQ. Recently, he's been more active. He's been getting more wins. And even his losses are looking really strong and solid. So I say all that to say I don't think that Steve Erceg is going to finish Kai Kara-France, but I do think that Steve Erceg will be able to get that decision victory against Kai Kara-France. So give me Steve Erceg via decision. For the next fight, we have our main event, the return of Israel Adesanya versus Dricus du Plessis. Very interesting main event for UFC 305, very pivotal for this whole division. So let's go ahead and review their stats here. Dricus du Plessis, he's 6 feet 1 inch tall, he has a reach of 76 inches, and he's 30 years old. On the other hand, we have Israel Adesanya, 3 inches taller at 6 feet 4 inches tall, with a 4 inch better reach of 80 inches. And he is 5 years older, though, at 35 years old. Age is creeping up on Izzy. When it comes to striking, Dricus lands 6.49 strikes per minute with a 50% accuracy. Now, Israel Adesanya, on the other hand, he lands 3.93 strikes per minute, so about half of those strikes, but with the same accuracy relatively at 48%. So Dricus does land a lot more volume, and he throws a lot more volume as well. Now, as far as grappling goes, Dricus du Plessis, he lands 3 takedowns on average with a 51% accuracy. Now, Israel Adesanya, on the other hand, he only lands 0.05 takedowns on average. Obviously, he has a kickboxing background. It's not a big part of his game plan, and he only has a 14% accuracy with those. So Dricus, so far, it seems like a more well-rounded fighter, right? Lastly, when it comes to defense, Dricus absorbs 4.77 strikes per minute with a 55% striking defense and a 40% takedown defense, whereas Israel Adesanya absorbs 3.11 strikes per minute with a 56% striking defense, which is relatively the same, but with a better takedown defense of 77%. And that's key. That's where he has some redeeming qualities. He does have that takedown defense that he's able to utilize and leverage, and also his striking is able to negate some of those advantages that non-strikers have, or, non-specialized strikers have against Izzy. I'm getting carried away here. Let's keep going. Dricus du Plessis' recent fight history. Recently, he's coming off of a win against Sean Strickland, which was via split decision. A lot of controversy because some people felt that Sean Strickland got that done. Let me know what you guys think. But Dricus du Plessis, nonetheless, he got that split decision victory, which was back in January of 2024. It kicked off our first pay-per-view of the year. Now, Dricus du Plessis, his total record, 21 wins and only 2 losses. Out of those 21 wins, 9 of them KO/TKOs, 10 of them submissions, and 2 decision victories, which gives him a very impressive 91% finishing rate. Sometimes you don't really realize how many finishes Dricus du Plessis has. He's able to get a 91% finish rate. Out of his 2 losses, 1 was via KO/TKO, 1 was via submission. Now, Dricus also has 8 first-round finishes, very impressive, and he's on a 9-fight win streak. That's huge. Although he hasn't faced a lot of the top of the competition, he's faced a lot of good fighters, but, not some of those guys that are at the very, very top. But he is on a 9-fight win streak, which nonetheless is very impressive, especially in his weight class. His most recent win was back in January of 2024, and his most recent loss was all the way back in October of 2018. Pre-pandemic, pre-all of that crap, 2018, the good old days. Now, on the other hand, we have the crazy talented kickboxer, one of the best to ever do it. We have Israel Adesanya. Now, recently, Israel Adesanya, he's coming off of that loss against Sean Strickland, which kind of shocked a lot of people. That was via unanimous decision back in September of 2023. And if you guys haven't seen that fight, or, if you don't really remember that fight, I highly advise you guys watch that. Israel Adesanya did not do good against a strong pressure style fighter. Sean Strickland, he has a very interesting stance. He pushes forward no matter what you throw at the guy. Very tricky to try to maneuver that kind of guy. Alex Pereira was able to catch him and maneuver, and that's because of his power. Israel Adesanya, completely overwhelmed. Sean Strickland, he dominated that guy. In between rounds, he was just standing up. He was staring him down. He was taunting him. He wasn't even listening to his coaches. I think at one point, the guy, Sean Strickland, pushed one of his coaches aside, shut up, let me fight this guy. I'm serious about this. I'm gonna take this guy and defeat him no matter what. And that's what ended up happening. And that kind of looks really bad for Israel Adesanya, because Dricus is a more technical and skilled fighter overall compared to Sean Strickland. I'm not saying, he's a better man, he's a better fighter, none of that crap, but I'm just saying from a logical standpoint, Dricus has a lot of skill. He's been absolutely killing it. He's very technical. So if Israel struggled with Strickland recently, and I know MMA doesn't always play out this way, but you have to kind of wonder how he's going to do against Dricus du Plessis. He's nearing the end of his professional fighting career. He's 35. Maybe he has 5 more years max in him. But his physicality's already kind of taken a toll no matter what. All right, I've kind of deviated from this piece, but let's talk about Israel Adesanya's total record here. Israel Adesanya, total record, 24 wins, only 3 losses. Very interesting matchup. Out of those 24 wins, 16 of them KO/TKOs. He has no submissions recorded, which we can expect out of, someone who's heavily in the kickboxing category of fighting. He does have 8 decision victories, giving him a 67% finishing rate. Out of his 3 losses, 1 was a KO/TKO and 2 were decision losses. He does have 7 first-round finishes. Recently, he's won 3 out of his last 5 fights, but he is coming off of that very pivotal loss to Sean Strickland. His most recent win was back in April of 2023, not too long ago, but it is collecting a little bit dust on that shelf. So he needs to get a win under his belt if he wants to break out of that dry spell that he's been facing recently. His most recent loss, of course, was that September fight against Sean Strickland. Now let's take a look at what my prediction models predicted for this fight, the weighted average of the models, and then my final pick that takes that and also incorporates other non-stat based research and fight film study observations and takes all of that qualitative stuff into account as well as the quantitative stuff for a very well-rounded, high accurate pick. So 6 of 7 of my prediction models are leaning towards Dricus du Plessis and only 1 is leaning towards Israel Adesanya. If you told me that a few years ago, I would be shocked. When we weigh the prediction models together, we're getting a 63.3% probability of victory for Dricus du Plessis. Now, for my final prediction, I am going to knock that down quite a bit. I'm giving Dricus du Plessis a much less confident 51% probability of victory. That's due to the fact that it's Israel Adesanya. He's had a crazy talented past. He's a very skilled fighter. He takes his losses, he learns from them, and he gets better and better and better. And I think this fight truly is 50-50. You could look at the guys' records, you could look at their stylistic matchup, pros and cons. This is a very, very 50-50 fight where both guys have something to prove, especially Dricus. I mean, this is the toughest competition that Dricus has likely faced. And for Israel Adesanya coming off of such a strong loss, this is huge. But let's talk about those stats, right? Israel Adesanya, he has a height advantage of 3 inches in this fight, a reach advantage of 4 inches, which you best believe as a talented kickboxer, multiple champion, he's going to utilize those advantages. He absorbs 1.66 less strikes per minute, which is also impressive. He has a slightly better striking defense and a 37% higher takedown defense. The reason that I am picking Dricus du Plessis is the fact that Dricus is 5 years younger, 5 pivotal years younger. He lands 2.56 more strikes per minute. So I like the fact that he's he lands more volume and he throws more volume than Izzy does. And I think that sometimes that really changes the tone and the mode of the fight. He has a 2% higher striking accuracy, which is minimal, but still he's a little bit better in the accuracy department. And he lands 2.95 more takedowns on average, which could be key. I know Izzy has decent takedown defense, but can he leverage that against Dricus du Plessis and shut some of that stuff down? We'll have to see. Also, Dricus does have a 37% higher takedown accuracy, so he's more accurate with it, and he lands 0.7 more submissions on average as well. Now, Dricus, of course, just to recap, he's won 21 fights, finished 91% of them. He's had 7 UFC fights, so I know he hasn't faced some of the top of the UFC guys, but he still faced UFC level fighters. He's had 7 of those fights, and he's won all 7. In fact, he's on a 9-fight win streak. This guy has not lost for a long time, since 2018. That's 6 years. So let's talk about reasons aside from stats alone here. Dricus has several key attributes that I think will give him a victory over Israel Adesanya, but I can't say that with too much confidence. I'm giving him a 51% probability. If he uses the advantages that I'm about to talk about, he should be able to walk out with that win. But Israel, man, he's a tough guy. He learns from his losses. He's a very skilled striker, and he's great with those hesitations and using that range. I had to knock it down. I could not just give Dricus a very strong confidence. So let's talk about those reasons, right? I like Dricus's grappling skills, and I think that could potentially neutralize some of Israel Adesanya's striking skills. Now, his knockout power does make him a threat as well when it comes to those stand-up exchanges, and I'm talking about Dricus. Dricus does have knockout power. He does have grappling skills. Dricus is a well-rounded fighter, and he can more times than not win in any fashion that he pleases because he's really good. And if his opponent is weak in a certain area, he can smell that, pick up on it, adapt his skills in the middle of a fight, and lean towards that particular skill to defeat his opponent. And I think that with him being grappling savvy and his ability to do really good in the striking, that makes him a very challenging opponent for Adesanya to come back to. Now, Strickland, you know what you're getting with Strickland. You're getting pressure and you're getting a lot of strikes. That's it. There's no magical spell to it. And if Adesanya struggled with that, well, what do you do with a more technical fighter? Those are the questions that I want to see how they play out this weekend. Very interesting. Now, Du Plessis, I will say that he is also a pressure fighter when he needs to be, and he has great stamina, and that's going to allow him to maintain a high pace. Even though the guy carries a pretty decent amount of muscle mass, he still has a good amount of stamina, and I think that that could also kind of exhaust Adesanya. Now, I will say Adesanya's stamina is also solid, so it's not like this is a crazy advantage, but Dricus seems to do really well even at the end of, even towards the end of a fight. I do like Dricus's unpredictable fighting style, and he has significant strengths in different layers of his fight game, and that's going to make it very difficult for Adesanya to counter. Israel's going to have to be very, very careful in this fight. Additionally, Dricus, he is mentally tough and he's confident, especially when it comes to high-stakes situations. He might have a bit of a psychological edge coming into this fight. Now, especially when you consider the fact that the guy who defeated Adesanya, Dricus defeated him to grab the championship off of him. So Dricus defeated Sean Strickland defeated Adesanya. What do you think that does to Du Plessis' confidence? Of course, it brings it to the roof, right? Now, Adesanya, I will say, he does have a little bit of vulnerabilities that are starting to show in his fight game, especially if you see his more recent fights. The Strickland fight is a huge example of that. And of course, you have to consider the effects of aging, that being 35, you know, it's very different than being 30 in MMA. So those are all factors that Du Plessis could exploit in this fight, but still, I do respect both of these guys and their skills as fighters. And I think that both of them are very equally able to get it done this weekend. There is value on Adesanya if you are leaning towards Adesanya. My betting video will be a little bit later this week in a couple days, but I mean, I'll just tell you guys this one up front. If you are leaning towards Adesanya, there's the KO/TKO if you want some value. And if you are leaning towards Dricus Du Plessis, there's also the KO/TKO that has some value. A couple things to keep in mind there. I personally think that Dricus Du Plessis gets it done and he wins via decision. I don't see him getting the KO/TKO. I'm just trying to point out a little bit of value for you guys before that betting video later this week, which will show a lot of value and opportunities for this card. I think that Dricus Du Plessis, bottom line, gets it done via decision. I've really enjoyed covering this card, and I hope you all enjoy and all your bets hit this weekend. And with that, those are all of the fights for this weekend's event. I hope you all enjoyed the analysis and that your bets hit. Thank you guys for watching. Please like and subscribe as it'll help keep me motivated in creating these videos. Running this data, analysis, prediction models, and creating charts and graphs takes hours every day and week, so your support is always appreciated. Please also check out my Patreon if you'd like to support me through there. There's a $10 a month contribution option and a premium $20 a month option, which comes with early access to all of the analysis from this video, as well as promising underdogs, favorites, prop bets, and all of the extra data analysis and stats as well. This analysis, information, and these stats will help you with your bets, and it'll help support my efforts to continue providing and expanding content for you all. So please check out that Patreon if you want to show me some love and help me out there. Thank you all once again for watching, and as always, see you guys in the next one.